we're about to have a very interesting panel. All right. But before it begins, I do want to make an announcement, okay, that there's going to be a kickoff meeting. It's actually a physical meeting at the Hewlett-Packard headquarters on September 29th on the whole Mars Home Planet initiative. But anyone here or anywhere can join it by internet. And the URL is marshomeplanet.com. Google Mars Home Planet, and you'll find out how you can participate in that meeting. Mars Home Planet Meetup. Okay, thank you. All right, so we're now going to have a panel on the social and philosophical implications of the human exploration and settlement of Mars and space in general. And we have a number of distinguished thinkers on this panel. People already have met Greg Benford, science fiction author, Paul Davies, physicist, cosmologist, James Heiser, who is a bishop with the Lutheran Church and also a founding member of the Mars Society, and Jim Pass. And unfortunately, I don't know Jim Pass's background, but...
you could just say
what?
An astrosociologist.
He is an astrosociologist.
What does that mean?
And so I guess Jim is also an astrosocial moderator, and he's going to moderate this panel, so I'll leave it to him. Thank you.
You're moderating, okay.
All right, thank you. I think first we're going to just give you a little bit of background for each of us. And as we discussed, you don't know who I am probably. So my name is Jim Pass, and I received my PhD from USC in 1991, and I started out in sociology and criminology, and it turned out that there were too many people working on those issues. So, and I always had a love for space. So I kind of looked around, and I noticed that there weren't too many social scientists doing anything about space issues, and so I decided, to Google, some things and look around what was available. This was in 2003 in December, and I came across an article by Alan Tuff, who was writing about SETI, and he suggested that maybe we should create a new field called socioastronomy or astrosociology. And as soon as I saw that, the light bulb went off, and I purchased the domain for astrosociology.com, .net, and .org, and started a proprietorship called astrosociology.com in 2004. And ever since, I've been trying to create astrosociology as an academic field. And it took me a while to define what astrosociology actually was, since there was no such thing at that time. But I came to the definition of the study of astrosocial phenomena, which is the social, cultural, and behavioral aspects or patterns of outer space. And basically, ever since, I've been trying to get social scientists interested in space. I've called space sociology's Forsaken Frontier. I wrote a paper on that in 2004 because it was obvious that there weren't any social scientists doing much, except for a couple people like Al Harrison, for example, who was one of our first advisors. We created ARI, the Astrosociology Research Institute, in 2008, and he was one of our first advisors, and gave us a lot of legitimacy at the time, and so we've been carrying on with that. And we've come out with newsletters, and our second volume of our Journal of Astrosociology just came out. So basically, I've been trying to do that and also collaborate with what I call the other branch of science, trying to get the social scientists and the physical scientists interacting in ways in which the human dimension is brought in to the research. So that's my story. Paul?
So I'm Paul Davies. I'm really a theoretical physicist. I spent most of my life working in cosmology and the theory of black holes and what is loosely called quantum gravity, so very theoretical stuff. But I became interested in what is now astrobiology about 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. I've always been intrigued by how matter turns into life, what is life, and so I was one of the people who founded the Australian Centre for Astrobiology when I worked in Australia. For the last 11 years, I've been at Arizona State University as director of the Beyond Center for Fundamental Concepts in Science, where we sit around and we wrestle with things like how did the universe begin, how did life come into existence, what is the destiny of mankind, time travel, space travel, all that sort of fun stuff. In the afternoons, we do some teaching. So that's really my background. And as far as Mars is concerned, well, I've always thought Mars is the best hope for finding life beyond Earth. But as I explained in my talk, whenever it was, yesterday, just because we find life on Mars doesn't mean it's a second genesis. It could have got there from Earth or vice versa, so that's a complicated story. I've also been interested in the colonization of Mars. I think we do need to go to Mars, and I wrote an article in the New York Times in 2003 about one-way missions, that the only way we're going to do it is go in one direction. I was much inspired by Bob Subrin's Mars Direct idea, and so based it on that. And the president of Arizona State University read this article in the New York Times, and he said to his deputy, "We've got to recruit that guy." And sure enough, that's where I work now.
Okay, Gregory?
I'm Gregory Benford, a professor of physics here at UCI, and I'm best known for making stuff up. And so that's how I got on this panel, I think. Some years ago, I was discussing with a friend whether there was any uniting principle that I believe the vast bulk of humanity could agree to, and I said, what about the assertion that the one great element that uniting us was that we are all in favor of the expansion of human horizons in every sense that our horizons, physical and mental, can be expanded. And that's actually the reason I was in on the beginning at the Mars Society, because I do buy the Frederick Turner vision that American culture was largely encapsulated in the idea of the westward expansion and that the sky's the limit. You may have seen the plenary address I gave days and days ago with the old map of the United States in 1812, and in which even Thomas Jefferson said that he thought it would be 1,000 years before the Republic reached the ocean, meaning the Pacific. And of course, he was off by 1.5 orders of magnitude, but you know, it had the, as we say in physics, you only have to get two things right: the sign and the magnitude, and you get partial credit for either one. So, this society is based on the idea that one of the great liberating influences of this century could be indeed the solar system, and my assertion later was that it better be, because there are a lot of things we're running out of, and one of them is living room, but I don't think Mars is really going to take billions of people. But the main point is that it's, you know, when you have a steam kettle that's wailing at you, you don't have to open the whole kettle. You just pop a little release valve, and it changes the thermodynamic equilibrium enormously. And the same thing will happen for this society, I think. The wild and crazy peoples, many of whom are in this room, will escape through the tiny little knothole leading to Mars. And they, I do share with Stan Robinson, I'm breaking this sentence up too much, they will share a vision that Mars is not just a physical, and let's mention the biological sciences occasionally, possibility, but a social possibility. Stan Robinson thinks it will lead to essentially anarchist communes working together with the occasional murder I think he's wrong about that because I think it's going to more resemble the American West with occasional gunfights. But I do think we will, emerging from the crucible of the 20th century, we will really find some new social means, which will mostly be availed by the amazing change in technologies. I'm speaking here to the people who are now looking at their cell phones, because the interconnectivity of all the humanity on Mars is a thing we don't talk about much, because it wasn't true in the Old West, but it will be true on Mars, that you can be on the other side of the planet and still in ready contact. And on a big, deserted, very dangerous place, that's going to matter a great deal. And of course, there are endless possibilities of robotics and so forth extending to the horizon. But one of the prospects I think that is encouraging is, indeed, I think there's some biological argument to be made for the possibility that when you get to be old like me, maybe less than 1G is a good idea. And we should try 0.18 and 0.28. As Joe Tether, I always think of him as Joe Tether, said in his talk yesterday. So that's my perspective, is that I think this is, in a way, an evolutionary shotgun. You know, it just goes in a very wide arc, and it will have many impacts, and we can't predict anything except that our instinct is that this will inevitably lead to positive developments, not negative ones.
Okay, thank you. And James?
I'm James Heiser. As Bob Zubrin was mentioning before, I'm a founding member of the Mars Society. He's not managed to run me off yet. Sorry, a little joke there. But no, in the sense that I was drawn to the Society precisely because it's an organization which is focused not just on the questions of how, but why. When I read The Case for Mars, Robert had the understanding that I think is really crucial to bring to this entire topic, which is, what's our motivation? Civilizationally, why do we care? Sometimes that's seen as something which is almost obvious to the kind of people who join the Mars Society because we recognize it as almost obvious. Well, of course, this is what man has to do next. And yet that's built an entire system of mythic structure that is antecedent to that declaration. Over the last 20 years now, I've been skating around various issues related to that construct while also serving in parish ministry. It's one of these things that always keeps in the front of my mind the reality of what this means in terms of the future of humanity. You know, what are our goals as a people, and how do they extrapolate from where we've been before? My academic background is primarily in historical theology. My area of focus has been from the basically Renaissance through the 17th century, which in terms of the American founding, the expansion of the West, etc., is a time in which you have this amazing attempt to interpret the present in terms of a re-understanding, recapitulation of the past, reimagining the past. We're doing something similar again now in that we're reconceiving our understanding of who we have been on the way to the present. And as a result of that, trying to imagine what a future for mankind looks like. It breaks hard into several different major schools, and this is something that, again, Robert's spoken to very eloquently over the years in terms of the utopian, dystopian visions for the future of mankind. For me, the important thing for us is to be looking at the possibilities of what we desire to be, not what we're afraid of what we might become. And while there are very many negative voices that are encouraging the worst in terms of application of larger mythic structures, I'll put it as neutrally as possible, interpreting the past in terms of, interpreting the present in terms of the worst understanding of the past, I see us as being well positioned to draw on the best of a vast heritage of human experience, of thought, and as those things have been explored in the realm of myth, and applying that to our present and future. And in that regard, it's not a matter of ever cutting ourselves off radically from what we have been, but precisely embracing the best and applying that in a new context. For me, that's that's the mythic significance of Mars, and that's why I'll continue to go on about it as long as you'll put up with me. So a little bit of background.
All right, thanks. Okay, that brings up a good point, the utopian versus dystopian view of the future. And what role do you think social scientists would have in determining or studying that and maybe applying the knowledge that we've gained, for 200 plus years in the social sciences, studying human behavior? My argument has been that we've needed sociologists and other social scientists on Earth for a reason, and that is to help us to understand human behavior and human interaction. So what can social scientists, along with STEM related individuals together, provide for the future of Mars exploration?
Wow. This is going to be a great experiment. I mean, Mars is the biggest petri dish we've ever had. And I think standing back and watching it evolve is not only going to be fun, but it would be the best thing to do for a while, because we're going to have a whole lot of people with different opinions growing a very small village at first on the surface, trying to make a buck somehow. And I expect that there will be a great deal, a ferment of political experimentation under the enormous constraint of the harsh environment that will evolve very different possibilities. The only extended work I've written about Mars was The Martian Race, published in 1999, which is treats explicitly the discovery of life beneath the surface, of which I have become more convinced with the ever-present small explosions of methane we have detected directly on the surface, and which I was told by many authorities at NASA were absolutely impossible. Because I think, in fact, the presence of subsurface life then casts a whole new dimension on it. There are good friends of mine like Joan Slonczewski, who believes that if there's life on Mars, we should never explore it, out of an ethical position that she appeared to have recently discovered. Because it's probably just microbial, but it might be larger. And in the novel, I explore how only subsurface life might have evolved very differently than on Earth for various different reasons, both physical and biological, because there was no competition on the surface. And that possibility means that it's going to be a really mixed, strange place, because you're going to have alien life, whether it is agreeable to our chirality and elsewhere, or not. And that's going to also maybe be a resource. A biologist told me some years ago that in terms of total mass on this planet, there is more biological mass below the surface than there is above the surface, including us. There's a great long depth of microbial life, extends down many kilometers. We don't actually even know how far, because we haven't found a limit. And so it's a phenomenon we never think about, but may be influential and might be even a source of something. Who knows? Here's a whole bunch of life forms, and who knows where it's going to go. So it's just an enormous series of questions opened up by this possibility. And we shouldn't try to prejudge it. And one thing I think will certainly be a dead end is trying to impose the political wisdom that emerged from the great murderous 20th century on the 21st.
Could I just pick up where Greg left off? I always like to put in a word for Tommy Gold, the astrophysicist,
Yes.
who around about 1990 suggested the deep hot biosphere, that the rocks beneath our feet were teeming with life, and he was met with almost universal derision. And took about another 10 years for this idea to become part of the mainstream, and I continue to be dismayed by how poor Tommy Gold gets written out of history because very few people actually give him credit for coming up with this idea. I can remember hearing it from him in 1983 at a conference in Cambridge that Martin Rees organised called From Matter to Life. Tommy Gold was there. He was talking about this. In those days, he was more interested in looking for lucrative oil deposits under the ground, and that turned out to be a bit of a non-starter. But he was onto this, and I remember Freeman Dyson. We were sitting at dinner, and Stanley Brenner, who'd just taken over from Francis Crick there, said to Freeman Dyson, you know, what this crazy theory of Tommy Gold? And Dyson said, it's a good theory. So he was perceptive. So it's an interesting little bit of scientific sociology there. But I'd like to bring it back to sociology because I greatly enjoyed Greg's book, The Martian Race. And I'm old enough, like some people in this room, but not others, to remember the Cold War. Do you remember the Cold War? And all that money spent on arms, and people talked about the peace dividend. And we thought, wouldn't it be great? You know, the Cold War will come to an end, and there'll be all this money for things like space exploration and particle physics and so on. Well, the peace dividend turned out to be negative for the simple reason that a lot of the spur to exploring space came from that competition with the Soviet Union. And now we are faced with a spirit of cooperation instead of competition, and it's not a happy story. Now, in the Martian race, it is a race. There's a bit of a competition going on there. And the question is, I find this a very depressing aspect of humanity, that if ever there was a project that should unite us all, it is establishing a permanent human presence on the red planet. It's something that we should be able to bring together all nations, and space agencies, government agencies, and the private sector, and we should all regard this as a unifying venture. But I don't see that spirit, and I am depressed about the prospect of us ever doing anything exciting on Mars without some sense that unless we do it, the enemy will get there first. Now,
Yeah.
be interested to know what the panel thinks about that.
I would remind you
Negative
that
sentiment.
in my novel, the Chinese are the bad guys who show up suddenly. Spoiler alert! In this newfangled nuclear rocket, which the virtuous Western nations have eschewed, and look like they're going to take the race away. And I'm kind of hoping that actually is what they're going to do. And in fact, I saw an interesting report from an agency with 3 initials saying that there's broad evidence that they are in fact developing a nuclear rocket rather sophisticatedly, stealing a great deal from our 3 previous programs in nuclear rocketry, the last of which was classified. And it's in the Gobi Desert, and we have satellite photos of it. So, just saying.
And going back to the kind of initial point here of, you know, is there a place for the social sciences in all of this? I think certainly yes, because if human beings go to Mars, to put this as controversially as possible, the most interesting thing on Mars will be
Humans.
people. Absolutely. Because aside from the ability to interpret what we're seeing, the rest of it has no inherent meaning to itself. I mean, the rocks are not sitting around wondering about whether or not they have fossils in them. We're the ones who go and actually find significance and meaning in that which we're studying. Therefore, the most interesting thing on Mars will be human beings. And so, of course, everything that the social sciences can come to the table with in terms of offering help in that direction is of crucial importance.
Well, that brings us to another question about, you know, human exploration versus robotic, or do we look for a compromise? A lot of people argue that, you know, we can basically study everything we need to just from robotic probes and landers and rovers. Of course, I don't agree with that, and I don't think anybody here does, but what do you think about that kind of argument versus the need for human exploration?
You mean robots forever?
Or into the distant future?
Well, I know a lot of field biologists who think this is a party joke. If you're going to seriously think about the subsurface life, you can't possibly do this problem with robots because they don't have any versatility. I served on a Mars outpost program for 2.5 years at JPL, and we did an estimate of the cost of a single drill on Mars to look for this. And it was in $1995, which you may remember were enormously large compared to the ones we have in our pockets now. It was 1.7 something billion. One drill, no repeat business.
Could I just say that I think robots will get better, of course, and artificial intelligence, and generally, we lack the terminology, I think, for design stuff that is going to explore beyond Earth. And again, Freeman Dyson had some wonderful ideas. What did he call it? Recombinant entomology, where you re-engineer flies and so forth and ants, to sort of crawl all over Mars, and they're networked and send back information. All that's great, but there's no substitute when it comes to the human dimension. What excites us about Mars is the idea of humans on Mars. And okay, if the robots can go there first and do some science and make some mistakes and are there as an advance party and in a support capacity, that's fine. But nothing is going to satisfy human beings in their sense of poetry and romance and of human destiny than actually having Homo sapiens in residence on Mars.
Yeah. I think we all agree that it's best to have a relationship with robotic exploration, and we can accomplish more, I think, with robots than just with humans alone, too. So I think it's important to look at that kind of relationship from a social and kind of a cultural perspective.
Yeah, I might mention that the big conclusion at the Mars Outpost report, which was not widely distributed, was that before you send humans, you put down a reserve power capability, which had to be nuclear, computational ability, and a large team of robots. And you put it near of the several different warrens of caves we know on Mars, and you will have already used the robots to carry out extended, some biological expeditions into the caves before you send anybody.
Yeah.
And if you have detected life, you back off, the robots back off, little DNA analysis, so forth, and the humans come and take over the, well, I proposed the term we used, but it was rejected. I'm from Alabama. I said, let's call it the plantation. Because they're going to need to raise food, too. So there you go. And it's robots.
Okay. I think one of the interesting things to consider is what kind of community, as you know, we hear from SpaceX about sending hundreds or thousands of people at a time, or sequentially. What kind? One thing we talk about is, from the STEM perspective, of course, is how do we get there safely? How do we land and set up a base and so on? But beyond that, how do you set up a community and later on, as it grows, a society? Because as the number of people increase, the complexity increases. So with a small group of people, you can have everybody doing a similar kind of thing and people can cooperate. But as you add more people to the mix, then you have to kind of differentiate what you're doing, create a division of labor and so on. So how do we decide, what kind of society eventually will we create on Mars, or what types, I should say what types of societies, assuming that different entities, create their own missions. You could have a corporate kind of situation versus a religious situation, and you know, different kinds of people with different kinds of values going to Mars for their own reasons. So you know, we have to start thinking about institutions, culture. How do you create something that's cohesive and that doesn't, you know, destroy itself?
If I might just briefly speak to that. What we've found in previous experiences has been that you do have a certain self-selection bias in terms of, you know, expansion efforts, in that people tend to choose themselves for involvement in the organizations, whether corporate or otherwise, they're engaged in these activities. And they tend to be people who are cultural outliers within their own group.
That's a nice, polite phrase. I like
Yeah, well, put this gently. We're kind of the definition of this room is we're not exactly the most normal in terms of societal expectations. Because, I mean, what motivates us is something which is not that which is, you know, the running concern of most of the people that you interact with at the store, et cetera. I mean, their concerns are with something other than going to Mars.
Yeah.
And so, you know, go figure, or we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. So, look, I mean, you're going to have part of it being a matter of people are going to select themselves. And within then the structure of the societies that develop, I don't think we're going to have a lot of control even when we're in the middle of that process, because most of the decisions that will matter the most are the ones that we're not aware of at the time, because of all of the things that you take for granted and aren't even thinking about, because they're axiomatic to your approach to the world, to other people. And those things are going to simply happen and develop on their own, no matter what our intention is. So,
These are unforced errors.
right.
What about the
Exactly.
What about monitoring what's going on? Having social scientists and like psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, actually studying how things are evolving.
I think that'd be a great deal of fun, and will make for intriguing reading for those who come after, in terms of what that kind of contemporary analysis thinks is happening versus what someone 200 years later will think of their analysis.
Yeah, but that's for the novelists.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, you need a new journal, Astrosociology.
Yeah.
Well, I think actually you can actually do a lot by being there along with the engineers and the, you know, rocket scientists and so on, because, you know, we do that on Earth right now. You know, we monitor behavior. We try to understand why certain groups behave in a certain way, why subcultures are different from the larger culture. And there are applied sociologists, for example, who are in the field, not only studying what's going on, but trying to change any negative aspects.
Well, but, you know, we have a lot of earthly experiments. I mean, what I would immediately think would apply, and you may have written on this, is we have many millions of people who live in things for many years that are the size of New York apartments. And they open the door and there's a hostile landscape outside, and I'm not just talking about Manhattan, but on Mars it will be the same experience, right? So can we seriously learn something from urban dwellers now? I mean, the caves of steel, as our famous claustrophobe Isaac Asimov put it.
Well, I mean, that brings another point, which is...
Or agoraphobe, I got it backwards, sorry.
that brings up another point, which is, do we want to replicate Manhattan? Or do we want to kind of build a habitat, for example, that is, you know, basically replicating the positive aspects of society, where you have, since it's a harsh environment and you're enclosed, shouldn't we have more, you know, architectural and artistic things that are basically, you know, talking to the human condition in a positive way. So, you know, we design habitats that are more designed for social interaction than isolation, for example.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to go back to living in caves, at least at first.
Yeah.
Because that's clearly the easiest way to get screening from the really high energy cosmic rays, and you can seal it off simply with one big airlock and so forth. You don't have to build open structures. I mean, there are many interesting things about that, the biosphere and so on. But I seriously can't, have we learned anything about the long history of urban dwellers that we could apply to Mars? I mean, you know the field, we don't.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is a lot that you know, like I said, in the early stages, there's a lot that you can replicate in terms of how people interact. But looking at it as a long-term kind of project, for example, if you're in a cave and you want, have to grow crops, for example, but what about growing grass for a park, for example?
Mm-hmm.
To make, think about the leisure aspects of life on Mars, as opposed to just the occupational part of it.
Well, just, if I may, just to step back for a moment to the Manhattan example, we'll actually have to, I think, look to earlier models of social organization in terms of the requirements for daily life. Because in all of the early models, you're basically talking about a village style of life much more than a large community, right, which is going to require people who have very broad skill sets, but where, in a sense, because as soon as you said Manhattan, yes, many of the aspects are correct. What ends up happening is, and now walk outside of your little cubicle home and go grow your food. That what you might actually have is, structurally speaking, a very tight community in terms of living in very close association, but who then go from their homes out to where they work in agriculture. Everyone's going to be a farmer, et cetera. Much more like a late medieval model of, at night, you're within the walls. You didn't live where your farm was or where your field was. You went out there by day and then came back to the point of safety. And while it's not a direct analogy, I think in terms of social organization, we're going to perhaps see a deliberate effort to keep what is viewed as community very tight, but then have a deployment for various social tasks. And that's a different form of organization.
Yeah, that's a mechanical solidarity situation.
Exactly.
Where everybody is similar, everybody shares the same experiences. And then, but we also have to think about growing from there too.
See, we have to wrap it up. Can I just throw a wrench in the works, spanner in the works, as I would call it? That we've been talking all about the sort of sociological, political issues, but there's a fundamental scientific issue about a self-sustaining human colony on Mars, and I've raised this before, and not many people have taken up on it, but it's a really, really important point, that it's not sufficient to send humans and a few pigs and potatoes and whatever. The life on Earth is a very complex web of which most species are microbes, and the complexity of this microbiology is staggering. We alone, I'm sure everybody now knows this, where there are more microbes inside you than cells of your own body. You've got about 1 trillion bacteria and archaea in your gut and other organs. You couldn't live without it. When you go into space, the gene expression of these organisms changes. We have a project at ASU studying astronaut microbiomes in zero-G. It's a real problem. What we don't know going to Mars is what is the minimal subset of microbiology that has to accompany the potatoes and the cabbages and the pigs and so on, that it can be self-sustaining. We don't even know how to go about thinking about that, but it's very clear that you can't just take the obvious things you need. You've got to take all this microbiology as well, and when you get it there, it may change its behavior, and it may wipe you out. So it's a really fundamental obstacle.
Yeah. Let me point out that there are also going to be aspects that have come up in the idea of space habitats. That is, it's going to be dangerous. There are going to be scarce resources. For example, nitrogen. Nobody's really talked about the problem of how do you get enough nitrogen to grow crops on Mars, because there's not a lot of free nitrogen, whereas you and I are just whooshing it in our lungs carelessly right now on Earth. And so there's going to be a lot of control necessary. It ain't just going to be a friendly folk village, but they're going to be, every airlock is a potential lethal threat. Yes. So that's going to be an interesting sociology we have not really experienced before at all. It's more like living, look, it's like a party on a submarine. It's the way I think of it.
So let's open it up to questions.
Yes, I'd like to ask the panel about the functions of the colonists after the initial, exploration. They set up the initial colony. They've expanded in situ resources and habitats and whatnot. What is the panel vision as what are these people going to do after, scientific curiosity and exploration? Is there a function after that?
Well, luckily, no one is going to suffer from obesity. But after that, we're going to have to find a profit model. And I like the retirement idea that was ponied up 2 days ago. Kind of fits me. I'd buy into that. But I don't see another model because I don't see anything except maybe rare earths, which are indeed rare on Earth, that we can sell, we Martians.
Let me just say real quick, you have to basically look at social organization in terms of replicating how the community, let's say, will run itself, how it will function, because you need certain, not only the economy, but what about family, criminal justice system. You're going to have deviants. Well, as a sociologist, I don't know about that.
I mean, in short, they're going to live. I mean, it's going to be, that one of the great luxuries that they will have with time is boredom. Because they will settle into a pattern that will seem normal to them, where they will, pursue their vocations and have families and, govern themselves with varying degrees of competency. They'll live.
Yeah. For example, you'll work every day.
Yeah.
I grew up on a farm where my grandmother famously used to say, "Them pigs don't slop themselves,
Right. Right. Exactly.
Just a brief comment. I grew up in Manhattan on the 4th floor of a tenement building in street after street lined with buildings full of people, 6 stories, 10 stories, now of course they're even higher. We went to our public interaction, we walked to parks. We talked to each other on the street. I walked to the East River, I walked to the Hudson River, I went down to the bay and went on. So all of these things, the options would be far in the future for that first couple of generations. So I think there's 2 things there. One would be the self-selection of people who just know that they wouldn't be able to stand that first generation's limitations. And the other is how far can you go with the simulations and the virtual reality?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think even though things will be difficult in the beginning, I think you still have to emphasize social interaction in the sense that people interact with each other in a way that is a positive kind of situation as opposed to isolating themselves, which can turn into something dystopian pretty quick. So, cooperative interaction during work, but also whatever leisure time, if they can, figure out ways to interact when they're not working in ways that are positive and not boring, I think that will go a long way.
Everyone who knows me here knows that I'm very gung-ho about reproduction on Mars, but that certainly will not be the case in the first 20, 50, some such number of people. And I wonder about monasticism as a sort of first wave phenomenon on Mars. Benedictine monasticism, or there are other monastic traditions where people they don't expect to have sex, so that whole problem won't arise. And they also are, used to a communal way of living together, often, in a farming community.
Well, I think actually you're onto something there in the sense that what's perhaps the most likely would be along the lines of what they used to refer to as anchorites, which wasn't actually a communal life that way, but was a solitary individual, maybe one or two. Without necessarily a religious motivation to it, that is a means whereby for those who are psychologically and spiritually well suited for it, those could be the kind of people who actually do a lot of the initial construction for the benefit of those who will come later. If you want a sense of vocational purpose, I think for someone who is able to endure the rigors of that kind of a life, that's something that they could know they were making a positive contribution, because as you and I've talked about, there are a lot of environmental issues in terms of human biology that are highly significant. You know, you want to mitigate before people want to start having children. So.
Could I tell a little sociology story that was prompted by that question and Greg's talk about having a party in a submarine? I knew a submariner very well, and in these nuclear submarines they go down for months, maybe even years, and it's a very difficult environment for people to get on. And he said the only time they had a near riot was that a puritanical member of the crew gathered up all the pornographic magazines and expelled them through a torpedo tube. So for what that's worth.
What a metaphor.
I hadn't thought of that.
So, am I next, or are you next?
I guess I'm next.
Okay.
Okay, so we have such an impressive group of people here. You're social scientists, you're physicists. I'm a chemist, environmental scientists, epigenetic engineers I've met here. So, but we still have the feel of preaching to the choir. How can social scientists help motivate engineers and scientists to get beyond the zero-sum game of trading off between engineering certainty, a certain platform, and getting the innovative technology? We need to make this a practical matter for more people, that they can see the wisdom of coming with us.
You know, the best thing about the choir is that it can sing. And if you all go out and begin to talk about this in your intelligent communities and make that case, then we'll get the incubus for that, because there are a lot of great engineering problems here, and that's going to thrill those who read Analog Magazine, but we actually need to talk about the grand prospect to sing and make this discussion large enough so you can do exactly as you said.
Yeah, I think also one of the challenges is to get social scientists to join the choir, because the problem is that most social scientists look down to the ground and not up at the sky. And they don't think, a lot of, I'd say, talking about mainstream sociology, which is my background, the mainstream doesn't see space as an important issue. They look at other things that they've traditionally studied, like criminology and family and social inequality, which are all important, and they're even applicable to space exploration. But they look at the terrestrial aspects of it. Yeah. And that's what ARI is trying to do, is to get humanists and social scientists involved, and also to interact and collaborate with the STEM disciplines.
A lot of the social scientists I've known, just particularly here at UCI, seem to be depressives. Is this why?
That could be part of it.
Yeah, a lot of alcohol involved too. We haven't talked about alcohol. I wrote a story called, it's been reprinted several times, called "All the Beer on Mars," about guess what's going to be the first social innovation?
Yeah, just briefly on the topic, it's not the beer on Mars part. Really, it's a matter of peer group outreach for those who are of have an interest in the social sciences. We have to, do outreach within our own communities, and that's the long, slow process with this. I mean, for all of us, because every year we will have the people who will very understandably say, well, why don't we have more folks who fit this particular description here? Like, well, you could ask them. Ask, within your own peer groups, and seek to expand the outreach according to those who you would like to see better represented in the movement. Take up that responsibility yourself, because this has always been a collaborative effort. That's one of the things I particularly appreciate about the Mars Society is it's always been hard to define in terms of its makeup, precisely because it's not just a industry organization or an academic organization, but precisely because of its fascinating composite nature. Talk to the people that you want to see involved on an ongoing basis, not just in the sense of coming to a conference. It means actually, taking up the responsibility and, getting the courage together to tell people, but that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, I would say that we're making progress. It's slow, but for example, like I said, we have our issues of Astrosociological Insights, which is a newsletter, and we've gotten people around the world to contribute to that.
How do you find that? Is it online?
Yeah, it's online at astrosociology.org in a virtual library.
Oh, good.
Yeah, everything's free, so.
Okay, I have a philosophical, theological question. So you look back in time at the great collision between science as it grew up out of the late Middle Ages and faith, in terms of finding that the sun didn't revolve around the earth and so forth and so on. And it led to a huge amount of conflict and then eventually, I think, a strengthening of theology and purification of a lot of church teachings. So as we look now, there are tens of % of Americans, a very substantial minority, that don't believe in evolution. As Jim and I both know, as Texans, there are tens of % of our fellow Texans send their kids to private schools where they're taught that it's all, liberal lies and so forth. Let's say that we go to Mars and we find a separate genesis of microbial life. What would be the impact to faith, religion, society, philosophy here on Earth?
I love that question because it's one that we actually answered hundreds of years ago, and this is, I think, part of the difficulty with a measure of myopia in many modern faith communities. You can look at somebody like Kepler, for example. I always like citing him. He was a Lutheran. University-trained theologian first, by the way, and incidentally an astronomer. But in terms of his own assessment, in his, I think it was in his book, The Harmony of the Spheres, Kepler was already anticipating, well, of course we'll find life everywhere. And he goes into a great deal of speculation about the way in which life will be made for that particular world. And even in the realm of science fiction writers, I don't think you'd find too many who would dare to write about what kind of life would be well adapted to life on the sun. And yet Kepler was prepared to have even that speculation of, well, there must be some kind of solar life as well.
I wrote that novel.
Kepler actually got there first. But anyway, it's now I have to go and read that. Fine.
It's called The Sunborn.
Okay.
But that's a really good point. I'd forgotten about the sun part. So yet again, I've been scooped. It's
yeah.
But that's right. Kepler was very on board with that. How's this going to play out in Texas?
Yeah. Look, all of these shifts in worldview take time, and I think certainly as the science itself continues to shift and develop, I'm not greatly dismayed by any more than I would be by someone in the middle of the 1600s holding to a Tychonic view as opposed to a Copernican or Ptolemaic.
One of the great things about science is that the curiosity about this second form will swamp everything else, and you should ride that wave.
I wrote a whole chapter on this very topic in the Eerie Silence, and it's dear to my heart, not only the history of discussing life beyond Earth and its theological impact, but also what I regard as a curious sort of inversion that for those people who think the origin of life was a miracle, finding life elsewhere is deeply problematic. For those people like myself as a scientist think that it's still mysterious and yet a natural process. There's nothing more uplifting than the thought that we live in a universe which is intrinsically bio-friendly and brings forth life and, I would hope, consciousness as part of the natural unfolding of the great cosmic scheme of things, and that would very much make me feel, I used the expression at the end of my lecture, at home in the universe. I think discovering a second genesis of life would do wonders to give human existence as an example, just one example of many forms of life in the universe, give it greater significance. So I think there is huge theological and religious implications to finding that life is a natural process and a cosmic process. So I think that's a very uplifting message.
And I think the key thing is to never be afraid of knowledge. I mean, this is an ongoing learning process, and whether we go to Mars and discover that there's no life there, and we keep looking and find nothing, to embrace that reality and its implications. But no matter what the outcome of our studies, to not be afraid of continuing to learn. That's when we put blinders on ourselves in advance, that dooms the entire process if we let that get out of control.
But surely there are some who hold that self-knowledge is usually bad news.
There are some who do.
Last question. In my experience of just coming out of academia, go Sun Devils, when it comes to the approach that often the science community has towards religion, it's very cynical. And, it's accepting, it's a part of society, it defines how we relate to each other often. But when it comes to science fiction, I notice that religion shows up oftentimes as a workhorse, something that, the higher, more intellectual people leverage to their advantage to get things done, which is convenient, which is good. However, in my experience, looking past the history, religion is literally the backbone of any new civilization, society springing up in new locations. So do you think that there ever might be a more positive outlook towards religion's role in a society on Mars?
I think that it varies with individuals. Actually, ever since the first Mars Society convention, I found that for some people, apparently, religion's a great motivator to go to Mars. After I gave my first address to the first convention, I had somebody come up to me and wave his finger in my face, telling me that it was because of people like me that we have to go to Mars to get away from us. So I appreciated my ability to motivate people who want to go to Mars. So.
I thought he wanted to get away from the Catholics.
I'm not sure he was drawing a lot of distinctions.
Okay, so go forth and multiply and fill the universe with life. Okay.